by introducing you out. Okay. Good afternoon. Today I'm very happy to talk to an up-and-coming songwriter, Adam Gwon. Good afternoon, Adam.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Sunnyside, Queens in New York City.
Okay. Let's go back in your. You were born in Chicago, in Illinois,
No, I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, actually.
Boston, Boston.
Yeah, that's where my dad grew up and where my mom moved after she graduated college and met my dad. So I was born in Boston, but my parents moved down to Baltimore, Maryland when I was about 2 years old. So that's really where I grew up and where my family still lives today.
And where does music come into your life? How does it happen? At what age?
I was always drawn to pianos from a very young age, sort of without reason or explanation. Anytime I would go over someone's house that had a piano, or, I was at the mall and walked past the music store, I would just go up to pianos and start sounding out songs that I knew. Um, and so my parents very wisely decided to put me in piano lessons. And it so happened that my neighbor in Baltimore was the organist for the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. So he became my piano teacher. I think I started piano lessons probably around 8 years old. Um, so I studied with my neighbor, the organist in the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, from 8 years old all the way through high school, and was primarily focused just on classical piano in my lessons. Because he was an organist, I would take organ lessons with him in the summer. So I did piano during the school year and organ over the summer. Um,
Do you have a really big organ there? I mean, with lots of keys and
yeah, well, he played at a church that was nearby, and so when I took organ lessons in the summer, we would have lessons on the organ at the church, which had all of the different keyboards and the stops and the
does it
foot
make you
pedal
very,
keyboard.
were you very
Um,
happy at this? Is it better than a piano?
no, I always liked the piano better, but the organ was fun just because of all the bells and whistles, and I was a short kid, so it was always sort of a feat of acrobatics to be able to play the organ and sort of like slump down and hit the pedals on the floor, and also deal with all the different keyboards on top. So it was more just a fun distraction, but I was always a piano guy at heart.
So when do musicals come into your,
That's a really good question. I joined the drama club when I was in middle school, just because all of the kids that I thought were cool in middle school were doing the drama club. And so
at
that
one point
started.
you were going to be an actor, am I correct? At
I
one
guess
point you
that's
like,
that's yeah, that's I started so in middle school I started performing in the shows we did. Oliver was one of the first shows I was in, and The Wizard of Oz. Um, and it so happened that as I was finishing up middle school, the Baltimore public school system was launching a bunch of magnet high schools that each focused on a different subject area, and one of them happened to be a school for the arts. So kind of on a whim, I auditioned for this magnet school for the arts in Baltimore and got accepted, and so was part of actually the first graduating class at this high school for the arts in Baltimore. Um, and I was essentially majoring in theater, but in a public high school. So we had all kinds of theater classes, and alongside of our regular academic classes. So I just sort of got bit by the bug, and I did in fact have one of the interesting things about this school, because it was newly opened and was focusing on the arts, is that it drew a lot of teachers in all subject matters who are interested in the arts. So, the math teachers applied to work at the school specifically because they were interested in the arts. And in fact, one of my English teachers was just a diehard theater fan, and in particular was a diehard Stephen Sondheim fan. And that was really my first introduction, I think, to writers like Stephen Sondheim, was through this English teacher who, on breaks in class, instead of a normal teacher who might spend a class period just put in a movie for the class to watch to kind of take a break, he would put on the cast album for Assassins and just play it, and that would be our class period. So I got a strange and wonderful education in that way as well. And one of the things that first turned me on to writing new musicals was the school's partnership with the big Equity Regional Theater in Baltimore, Baltimore Center Stage. We went to all of the student matinees that they put on of their productions, which basically meant we went to see the show, but we got sent a script of the show ahead of time, so we got to talk about the shows we were seeing, and a lot of them were new shows, and one of them was this musical that I love that's very strange called Das Barbecue, which is this country western retelling of Wagner's Ring Cycle. And that show, before, I think it ran off Broadway in New York, but before it got to New York, it had an out-of-town production at Baltimore Center Stage that was one of the shows that our school went to see and had been sent the script and got to talk about. And it was the first time that I realized in a real way that musicals were something that people had to create, that they didn't just exist, for you to do in middle school, just to put on Oliver. Someone actually had to think of them and write them, and put them out in the world. So that, I think, was my first light bulb moment in terms of new musicals, and
So
that
did an
writing
idea,
musicals
how
was my
long
job.
before an idea hit you?
I didn't actually start writing shows really until after I had graduated from college. Like I think in my high school years, I got very into writing parody lyrics. Like Forbidden Broadway it was a big part of my teenage years. And so a lot of my creative energies in terms of thinking about writing, um, uh, I did a lot of silly parody lyrics for my friends. And then when I got to college, slowly started writing just one-off songs. I had a professor in college, who kind of was the first person to encourage me toward the songwriting route. Um,
Well, what
uh,
school is
and then
this? What school
I
are
went to
you?
NYU.
Ah,
I went to NYU, and I was, like you said, I was in their performance program at Tisch. I had applied there, as an actor, um, and they there's a rule at NYU when I started there that freshmen were not allowed to perform in productions because they wanted you to focus on your studies and get acclimated to the city and not really be distracted by going through a production process. But I really wanted to be involved in productions, and there was no rule about music directing. So I sort of became the go-to guy in the department to um, music direct shows and compose incidental music for the plays. So right off the bat, I just sort of got thrown into this position of writing underscoring for play productions, essentially. Um, and I had a teacher there who was a performance teacher, but was also, in his life outside of teaching, was a composer. And he heard me playing the piano one day and sort of pulled me aside and said, "Hey, I think that, like, I hear something in your voice, like over there, that I don't hear other places. So you should, like, check that, see what that's all about." Um, And that was my freshman year at NYU. And very sadly, that teacher, passed away like that spring. And I was going off that summer, to do a summer stock, as a performer, up at the Hangar Theater in Ithaca, New York. And while I was there, the theater was putting on a cabaret, and they said, "Hey, anyone want to write anything for this cabaret?" And another friend of mine who was there with me, we decided to co-write a couple songs that wound up being in this cabaret. Um, and that was my first time really writing a song, and I fell in love with it. And when I came back to school, just kept on writing songs. And by the time I graduated, really knew that was what I wanted to chase, much more than performing.
Did you have any thing to do with Meg Bussert at NYU?
I did not. I did
Evidently,
not.
there are two NYU schools, right? The Steinert and there
There are two.
two.
Yeah, there's a theater program at the Steinhardt School and a theater program at the Tisch School. And I was in the Tisch program. And weirdly, there is not a lot of overlap for some reason. Like they do their own productions, they have their own performance spaces. At least when I was there, it was very, very separate in a strange way. In
Well,
fact, I remember one of the um, uh, when I was at NYU, I directed a production of Songs for a New World by Jason Robert Brown, and Jason came to see it. And I remember that the Steinhardt School around the same time, so my production was in the Tisch program, and the Steinhardt School was doing some sort of concert tribute to Jason Robert Brown and Adam Gettle and like sort of that crop. It was all around like when I first got to NYU, Audra McDonald's first album came out and sort of introduced that group of writers to the world. Um, and so the Steinhardt School was putting on this concert of their songs, and Jason had seen our production of Songs for a New World, and they were doing a bunch of Songs for a New World songs, and Jason was just like, "Well, why don't you get the NYU kids who did the production and know the songs and they can sing it?" There was a whole like kerfuffle. There was a to-do because there people were getting very territorial. But eventually
I mean,
Jason could.
physically, how far apart are they? I mean, NYU is all over the village, basically.
Yeah, I mean
And
the
when
buildings are very close to one another.
I went to see shows on Broadway.
Yes, it's
The which
The Tisch
which
building is on Broadway. It's 721 Broadway.
right.
And then the Steinhardt building is around the corner. And I think their theater is on Mercer or West Fourth. Like it's a little bit, it's literally just around the corner, sort of a bit closer to Washington Square Park.
So what else did you wind up doing at NYU?
Well, like I said, the interest in writing sort of slowly took over as the years went by there, and it all sort of accumulated. My senior year, I was in a production of Mother Courage that the NYU season was doing, and I also wound up writing the score for that because there are a bunch of songs in there that Brecht wrote. And the director who was directing it was this wonderful guy who I'm still in touch with named Robert Richmond, who at the time was part of this great theater company called Aquila Theater Company, which sort of did these reimagined versions of Shakespeare classics and Greek classics. And Robert's now teaching down in South Carolina. But he did this wonderful production of Mother Courage set in the Wild West. And so I got to write this kind of country western score to this Brecht show, and that was the last. That was sort of my big hurrah at NYU right before I graduated. Um, uh, and so once I left, I sort of was like, oh yeah, the writing thing feels like the thing that I'm interested in, the thing that I want to pursue.
So what year is this that you're graduating?
I graduated in 2001. So another crazy thing was like right after I graduated, was 9/11. Like that was one of my first experiences as an adult in the world. And I was living downtown in New York. Like it was a crazy time.
So what happens after graduation?
I graduated from school and um, I was working two jobs right when I graduated. By day, I was interning at the Roundabout Theater Company in their administrative offices. So I would do that during the day. Um, but the intern salary was not quite enough to actually pay one's rent on. So by night, I was running the sound for a production of Much Ado About Nothing that this theater company, Aquila Theater Company, was producing down at the 45 Bleecker Street Theater. Um, and Robert Richmond, the man who directed this production of Mother Courage that I had just done at NYU, also directed this production of Much Ado. So I would work in the Roundabout offices during the day, and then at night go down to the 45 Bleecker Street Theater and run sound for this production of Much Ado About Nothing. And that show, I remember that show was a really big hit and ran for a long time, which was great to have that gig for a while. And it also taught me something really interesting. It was the first time that I sort of became aware of um, the influence that New York Times reviews have on shows, because I got this really great review in the New York Times, and there was a specific line in the show that the New York Times review quoted, um, that hadn't been particularly getting a lot of laughs up until then. But as soon as the review came out, everyone laughed at that line that was mentioned in the review. It was the weirdest experience
Remember,
to me.
you remember
Um,
what the line was?
I wish I could. I remember the production they had set, they turned it into kind of like a British spy farce. So it had this kind of sort of cool, almost like Austin Powers kind of feel to it, and all the music in the show is this like sort of 60s mod pop. Um, uh, and I wish I could remember what the line was that the review mentioned, but it was really striking. I was like, oh, people weren't really laughing at this line before, but now they've been told that they should laugh at it by the New York Times, and they do. Um, so that's what I did right after college. By day was interning at the Roundabout, and by night was um, running sound down in the Village.
And what happens after that?
And then, I mean, all this while I was writing, and I was working on my first. Like I said, up to this point, I hadn't really written any musicals. I had just written a bunch of songs. Um, and the first musical I ever wrote was um, called Lulu, and it was sort of inspired by this series of plays by Frank Wedekind, who's a German playwright, the same playwright actually who wrote the play of Spring Awakening that the musical
Right,
is based
right.
on. He has these two other plays that are about this character named Lulu, who's this kind of femme fatale. It was turned into a very iconic silent movie in the 1920s. And a friend of mine from NYU who is a director, we just were cooking up this musical inspired by that character, and that was the first musical I wrote, and we did it in the Fringe Festival and the New York Musical Theater Festival, um, which I think just ended sadly. Um, but yeah, that was the first musical that I wrote, and we did a whole like um, uh, yeah, like a
And are
run in the.
you are you doing music and lyrics, or what exactly are you doing?
I wrote the whole thing on that one, so I did book music and lyrics on that first musical. And if I recall, I like music directed it and played the piano in the show. Like it was one of those kind of like self-produce, do everything, and I was very burnt out by the end of it. Um, but uh, but it was great fun, and I met a lot of really great people working on that project that I'm still very
Was that
close with
reviewed?
today.
I know occasionally there's so many productions that obviously many show the majority of the shows, but sometimes the New York Times will pick
It's
a
true. Yeah,
group.
yeah. I don't think we were in the New York Times. There are definitely reviews, but I don't think we definitely weren't in the Times. I don't think. Uh,
The
and
Village Voice, maybe Village Voice.
maybe. Um, yeah, it was a funny. I feel like it was. I'm trying to remember the timeline. It was sort of. I think it was right after because I remember there was a big when You're in Town went to Broadway. That was like a whole. It sort of changed the perception in a way of the Fringe Festival because it was this huge success that came out of the Fringe, and I think a lot of people's attention uh, turned to those festivals in a major way in the years after You're in Town. And we were definitely in that pocket. Like you could feel there was still all of that kind of buzz and energy around the shows because of successes like You're in Town. Um, but yeah, I don't think we were in the Times for that one.
So what show comes after Lulu?
Um, let's see. After Lulu, I wrote another show which never got produced. That was an adaptation of Ethan Frome, the Edith Wharton novella, which a friend of mine um, sort of brought to me and was like, "Hey, let's write this thing." So we worked on that for a while and did a bunch of like workshops and readings and that kind of thing, but it never sort of found a home. Um, and then after that, I was accepted into the Fellows program at the Dramatist Guild, which is a group of emerging writers. They bring together five playwrights and five musical theater writers every year, essentially to be part of a writers group where you're bringing in work every week and sharing it and getting feedback. And when I did it, it was curated by the musical theater portion was curated and run by Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty. So they sort of became the main mentors for the year. And it was there that I started working on a show called Ordinary Days. Um, which again is a show. When I was working on the Ethan Frome adaptation, I was doing music and lyrics and collaborating with a book writer. And then for Ordinary Days, I was in this fellowship at the Dramatists, all on my own, just as a songwriter without a collaborator. So I knew that I wanted to work on something during that fellowship year that I felt like I could put together all on my own. So I just started writing some songs, and eventually this idea for this four character musical kind of into my mind. And so I spent the fellowship year at the Dramatist Guild writing the first draft of this musical, Ordinary Days, and that's the show that ended up sort of becoming my big break and got my first professional productions and got my debut at the Roundabout and is a
Are you
show that's
still are you still connected with working for the Roundabout? Or
at that point, I was not. I worked for the Roundabout. I was an intern for the Roundabout that summer after I graduated, and then got hired on to work full time in their administrative offices that fall. In fact, the day before 9/11, September 10th, 2001, was my first day hired on the staff at the Roundabout. So I worked for the Roundabout for I want to say about 3.5 years, and then um, left and had a more sort of freelancey existence. Like I got another office job that was just part-time and was able to cobble together enough other kind of freelance consulting jobs because one of my jobs at the Roundabout in the office was to work on their database that sort of managed the donors to the theater, which a lot of nonprofits, both in the arts and outside of the arts, use. It's a very common computer software program. So because became fluent in that through my job at the Roundabout, I was able to take on a bunch of more freelancy consulting jobs at other nonprofits to help with the database stuff. So I was doing all of that uh, while I was doing this fellowship at the Dramatist Guild and writing Ordinary Days. Um, uh, so when Ordinary Days found its way back to the Roundabout, I had left. I was not working there in the office anymore, and was sort of rejoining the company from this other side. Um, yeah,
This was done in a fairly new space called the Black Box.
it's true. Yeah, I think it was the third show that was produced in that black box space. Um, uh, And it's a wonderful space if your listeners have never been there. I highly recommend it. It's called Roundabout Underground because it's literally in the basement of the Laura Pels Theater building on 46th Street. And I love there's a great story behind how Todd Hames, the artistic director at the Roundabout, started this underground space because the Roundabout had long been known for doing revivals of classics, and started to produce new plays in their off-Broadway space, the Laura Pels Theater. And there was one show in particular, a Noah Heidel play called Mr. Marmalade, that everyone was really excited about, but I guess the production did not go very well, and sort of spooked uh, the writer and it was just it just sort of like the it didn't line up in the way that one would hope. And so Todd really he still wanted to pursue new work and fold that into the mission of the theater, but felt it was important to give writers who had never been produced professionally in New York before a sort of safer and uh, more nurturing way to introduce themselves to the professional theater world. So he and his now associate artistic director Jill Rafson dreamed up this Roundabout Underground program, where the criteria for being eligible for the underground is that you cannot have been professionally produced in New York City. So it has to be your professional New York debut as a writer. And part of the deal, which is great, is that not only do they produce your first show, but they commission you for your next one. Because the idea is that um, they want to invest not just in that first show that you write, but in you as a writer and make you feel like you have a relationship with this institution that's going to last beyond a single production. And I think that I just love that philosophy and think it's so important for writers to feel like they have a home base and someplace that they can go to and take their work and see it to fruition. And in fact, Scotland, PA was my commission that came out of Ordinary Days. So it worked its way upstairs to the Laura Pels.
When I went to see your first Ordinary Days, uh, I started to walk down the stairs,
Oh, no.
having been to the Black Box, and somebody said, you can't walk down.
It is many, many flights down.
Well, no, I believe that you have to take the elevator. Can you indeed walk all the way down?
There is, you can walk all the way down, though
We're
it
not
is
recommending
long,
it
and
for the
it
audience.
goes through the backstage of the Pels.
Uh,
So I feel like as an audience member, you probably aren't allowed to go because it literally sort of winds around the dressing rooms and the backstage area of the Laura Pels. And I think it
so,
is like 4 or 5 flights
so coming
down.
up was somebody named Stephen Sondheim coming, and I, of course, recognized him. And then we had a fairly long wait with the elevator, and no one recognized that it was Stephen
Oh
Sondheim.
no, that's
And
crazy. I
I
remember.
thought, I thought, do I have anything to say to him? Because I approached him. I said, no, I do not. I do not have anything to say to him. But I later then thought I had found out he had interned with Mary Rogers at the Westport Playhouse
Oh
the
wow.
entire summer. And had I remembered that, I would have asked him something about that. But he would not. He doesn't like questions from
Yeah.
strangers. He would, but while I'm watching the show, I had also a view of him, and he
That's
was really
amazing.
enjoying. Were you there?
Oh,
Did you
that's nice.
know that
I
he
was not,
was?
I did know they called me, Roundabout called me that afternoon and said, we just wanted to let you know that Steven Sondheim is coming to your show tonight if you would like to come. And I chickened out. I didn't go because I think I was like you.
What would you say?
I was like, what would I say? And that theater is so intimate, as I'm sure you remember. There's no way that I could have been not completely distracted being in that room, just watching him watch the show. So I didn't go. I chickened out, but I'm glad to hear that he seemed to like it.
Now the show is actually fairly simple, but there's something magical about it. Could you explain
Oh
what
gosh.
makes it relate? I was moved by these characters.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know what? When I was writing it, um, I pulled a lot from my just my experience of being, in my 20s in New York City. And so one of my fears when it first started going out into the world was that it might have this limited appeal to, people in their 20s in New York City. And in fact, the first production of it was in Pennsylvania. It was in at Pennsylvania Center Stage, which is the professional theater that's part of Penn State in State College. Um, and one of the things that people kept coming up to me after that first production, of all ages and all stripes, and just talking to me about things that they related to in the show and related to in these characters. Um, and it was just so interesting because one thing that Lynn Ahrens always said in the fellows program where I was writing the show, is that there's this very strange paradox that the more specific you write a character in a show, the more universal their experience becomes to the audience because suddenly it feels like there's a real human being on stage, that and you're relating to their experience. Because when I wrote the show, and especially I've thought about this a lot, around the song "I'll Be Here," which is sort of like the 11 o'clock number of the show, and probably the song that most people know. It sort of had a life outside of the show a little bit, and it is a very particular story with a lot of very particular details in it.
And are
Um,
you part of?
um,
Is part of
with
it your story or not your story?
It's not really. It isn't. Like I said, when I graduated from college, one of the first things that happened in the world was 9/11. And I happened to, a couple years after that, I went to, this program out at Northwestern called the Johnny Mercer Songwriters Foundation Project. Uh, which takes I think it's meant for songwriters who are under 30, and they you convene, it's musical theater writers and pop songwriters and songwriters from Nashville, just doing sort of a week-long songwriting workshop in the spirit of Johnny Mercer. And one of the things that they ask you to do, because it's sponsored by the Johnny Mercer Foundation, is to write a song that that is a contemporary piece of Americana, whatever that means to you. And so for that program, I wrote this song that was sort of about 9/11. It was more of a sort of like art song than it was like from a musical or a character or anything. But it was just about the experience of seeing like the skyline of New York City change, like the shape of it change. And I got invited after that workshop to perform the song at a fundraiser that a school in Staten Island was having a big fundraiser, and one of the parents at the school had been lost in 9/11. So they invited me to perform this song at this event. And they had someone speak. They had the man who was lost in the event, his wife spoke at the event. And I just remember being so moved by her story, which was so filled with hope and like the process of moving on after this sort of like insurmountable loss happens to you. And it was really that story that sort of gave me the seed of what happens in I'll Be Here. So fortunately it was not a personal story of mine, but rather one that I was inspired to tell, hearing this woman speak about her loss.
Is the show reviewed by the New York Times?
It was. It got a very nice review.
A main reviewer, do you remember?
It was
New York
Charles
Times?
Charles
Isherwood.
Isherwood.
Well, he became main.
Yeah. But yeah, that show sort of started my career, really. It's been done. It continues to be done all over the world, which is amazing to me.
And did Rodgers and Hammerstein get involved at this point and
They did,
get,
yes.
get the album recorded?
Yeah, so after the Roundabout production, Ted Chapin at the R&H theatricals saw it and really liked it, and said, "Hey, we want to license this, and as part of the licensing, we want to produce a cast album so that people get to know the show." And so we recorded the album with the cast. I think it was still a little ways after the show closed, but we reunited the actors, recorded the album, and I think that's
it's just four people and the piano. Is that
four people and a piano. That's right.
That's inexpensive. If you had a symphony, maybe it wouldn't have been so easy to get it recorded.
It's true. But yeah, so we made the album. It went out into the world. I think that's how a lot of people got to know the show. And a couple years later, Audra McDonald recorded this song "I'll Be Here" on one of her albums, and I think that really brought a whole new audience to the show who hadn't heard of the show, but heard Audra sing the song and got their interest piqued enough to check out what musical it was from.
Did the album sell a lot? Being in the record business myself, would you say it made money?
I think it has made money. I would have to look up the details, but I get.
You've had
I think
you've had productions all over the world, which is certainly helpful to selling albums.
That's true.
Of course, it's downloaded. I personally am not so happy to have downloads. I see you have some physical product behind you. I see CDs, but you also have an iPod with 80 original tunes on it.
I did like I one of my favorite things when we did the album is I wanted to research. We had to write the liner notes, the booklet that came with it, and so I went to the Lincoln Center Library and just like looked at all of the liner notes from all these old albums. That was one of my favorite parts of putting the album together. And you don't really get that anymore. It's not the same. I mean, I know people do digital booklets, but there's nothing like opening that CD and having the book and reading all the lyrics. Um, it's great.
Where where were all the lyrics in the booklet?
It was, yeah, yeah, yeah. The album is a slightly edited down version of the show because the show is mostly sung through, so most of the show is on that album. But we made a few trims just for the album, and so yeah, so the lyrics are in the liner notes for the album.
Tell us some of the places it's been done around the world.
Oh gosh, it's been on 6 continents. I think it's been on every continent except Antarctica, which is crazy. And it's been translated into, I think, 7 or 8 different languages. So it's been done in Japan in Japanese. It's been done in Korea in Korean. It's been done in German and Dutch, Spanish and Portuguese. It was done in South Africa like a year ago. It's really wild. It's been all over the place.
So what happens? You're very lucky to hit a small gold mine at the beginning. What shows do you try to write after that?
I've always been driven. I love collaborating. It's funny, even though I wrote Ordinary Days all on my own, I really love collaborating, and I especially love collaborating with playwrights. And so I think, especially those first shows after Ordinary Days, I just sort of like followed around the playwrights that I loved, and wrote some musicals with them. I wrote an adaptation of the F. Scott Fitzgerald story, Bernice Bobs Her Hair, with this fantastic playwright, Julia Jordan. I wrote an original musical called Cloudlands with an amazing playwright named Octavio Solis, that we did out at South Coast Rep. Collaborated with a wonderful playwright and novelist named Joe Mino, adapting one of his novels, The Boy Detective Fails, which we did down at Signature in Virginia. Um, I think those were like right after Ordinary Days, I was sort of diving into those projects. Uh, and yeah, have since written. I wrote another musical with Julia called Cake Off, which we did down at Signature in DC and out at Bucks County Playhouse. Um, a wonderful, actually, when I was doing the fellows program at the Dramatist Guild, one of the playwrights in the group was a playwright named Sarah Hammonds, and we really hit it off and wanted to write something together. So we wrote an original musical that was loosely inspired by one of Sarah's plays called String, which we premiered 2 years ago now, out at the Village Theater in Seattle.
Did I
And that was
not see that in New York?
um,
Was it not a festival kind of?
it was at the Nant Festival.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we did it up at the O'Neill and
Tell,
then at the Nant Festival in New York,
tell
which
us
is
what
how
the
it's.
idea of strings is.
String is really fun. It takes the characters of the three fates from Greek mythology, and supposes that they have been banished to Earth, and so they live and work in a modern day city, much like New York, but are still the fates. They work in an office building, uh, spinning and measuring and cutting the strings of humans' lives. And the plot of the show is that the oldest fate, the older sister who wields a scary pair of scissors and is meant to cut the string of your life when you die, she falls in love with a security guard in the basement, and of the office building where they work, and of course finds out that uh, his string is meant to be cut, and has to decide what she's going to do about it. So it's very fun. It's very fun. The playwright Sarah Hammonds had always been fascinated with Greek mythology as a kid, and sort of noticed that the characters of the three fates pop up in a lot of other characters' stories, but don't actually have a story of their own. And that's where her interests came in, about wanting to write a story that focused on the three fates as opposed to them being supporting characters in another god's story. Um, so yeah, it's a fun one.
What is the music like?
The music is, um, there's lots of, one of the fun things about String was that it's set in this giant fictional office building called the Infinity Office Tower. And so we have an ensemble in the show that's made of office workers in the building. So there's lots of sort of ensemble vocal world painting, I guess if you would call it that, sort of using the ensemble to create these different sounds of the world.
So is it
Because
somewhat a cappella?
it's not a cappella, but I would say that the ensemble vocals are almost like part of the instrumentation in a way. Because I really wanted to capture the sense of how these gods are perceiving the world, which might be a little different than how the mortals perceive it. And it was really fun to figure out how to do that with the music, and especially with using the ensemble of people we had to create these kind of soundscapes, in a lot of the songs.
And then did Michael Mitnick come to you with Scotland, PA? There's a
Yes,
movie.
yes, it is based on a movie. So I had
Did
after
you, did you know that movie?
I didn't before Michael brought it to my attention. I mentioned I had this commission from the Roundabout after Ordinary Days, and knew that I wanted to find a playwright to collaborate with on something. So Roundabout set me up on three blind dates with different playwrights that they thought I might get along with, and one of those was with Michael Mitnick, and we hit it off right away. Um, uh, Batted a couple ideas around, and one of the ones that Michael brought to the table was this adaptation of Scotland, PA. I'd never heard of the movie, but I went home and I watched it, and just fell in love with it. It was so strange and funny and dark, and I just thought it would be.
Okay, give us a general idea of what happened. It's loosely based on Macbeth and
Mhm.
McDonald's.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So it's essentially the plot of the Scottish play, set in a burger joint in rural Pennsylvania in the 1970s. So it's about this couple of burger shop employees, Mac and Pat, who work at a mom and pop burger shop called Dunkin's. And over the course of the show, they have taken over the place, renamed it Macbeth's, which is their last name, and end up falling from grace, shall we say, in their pursuit of their ambition to be the next fast food empire. Um, uh, so yeah, so Michael brought this movie to my attention, and he had seen it growing up. He's from Pittsburgh, Pennsiliania, and had seen it, I guess, when he was in high school, and sort of filed it away. And when he got to grad school, he studied playwriting, in grad school up at Yale with Paula Vogel. And Paula Vogel teaches a class there about adaptations, and in the course of a class brought up this movie as a really fun, really smart adaptation of the Shakespeare play. And so it sort of came back into Michael's consciousness. And so fast forward a few years later, when we met, he pitched it as one of the ideas, and we both were just captivated by it. Um, and yeah, got to and then embarked on writing it.
How many years does this take, and how different is your telling compared to movie telling?
Mm. I would say that we started. I want to say we got the rights to the movie in like 2014, and then the show premiered last year in 2019. So it was sort of a 5 year process. Um, and we definitely took some liberties. We changed quite a bit from the movie. One of the great things is we were in touch with the writer and the director of the film, Billy Morissette, who happens to live in Brooklyn. And when we got the rights to the movie through the film studio, and after that happened, out of the blue, I got an email from Billy Morissette that said, "Hey, I heard you're making a musical out of my movie. This is awesome. I live in Brooklyn. If you ever want to get together and say hello." So we met Billy fairly early on in the process, and he was wonderful. Like he knew so much about the putting together the movie. Like he had lived in that world for so long, and had so many smart things to say, and lots of advice to give, and at the same time really acknowledged that we needed to reinvent it into something that Michael and I were making, and something that would live on stage as a musical. So he wasn't precious about anything that he had in the film, and came to all of our readings, and just gave us wonderful notes. And like I said, was not precious about anything that we changed. In fact, one of the big things that we put into the musical was something that Billy told us that he had wanted to get into the movie but wasn't able to, which is there are these three characters of the stoners who are essentially the same as the three witches in Macbeth. And in the movie, they're just kind of they kind of show up at the beginning, deliver this prophecy, and then you don't really see much of them after that. And Billy had always said that he imagined those three stoners to be, that he always intended that they were voices in Mac's head that were manifesting themselves as these kind of otherworldly stoners, which is not something that's really in the movie. Like in the movie, he gets drunk one scene, is stumbling home, encounters these kind of three stoner hippies, who give him this prophecy, and that's that. But we kind of took Billy's idea that they were these voices in Mac's head, and ran with it. And so we made those characters of the stoners much more present throughout the story, and much more concrete as these kind of voices that Mac is hearing, and that are driving him on to do what he is going to do.
Do you think you were attempting to write more youth-oriented music for that? That was my impression.
Mhm. You know, one of the things I loved about the possibility of adapting the movie is that the movie is set in the 1970s, and has this kind of like classic rock vibe to it. And in fact, the only stipulation that the movie studio had when we approached them about getting the rights was that we keep the show set in the 1970s. And happily, that's what we intended all along, and was one of the things that I got really excited about, just because I think that palette of music during that era, is so rich and so theatrical. So yeah, I did a deep dive on my classic rock, brushed up my classic rock playlists, and took a spin.
You really have a wonderful cast there.
We
People who
did.
I've seen in a lot of other shows, which I didn't know whether that would happen, but it's nice to you tell us who. I've forgotten who they are, but can you
Yeah,
remind
yeah.
people that
Uh,
I saw?
our two leads, Ryan McCartan was Mac, and Taylor Amon Jones was Pat. We had the wonderful J. Armstrong Johnson playing Banco, who is the kind of lovable but dim-witted best friend of Mac. The amazing Megan Lawrence played
Yes, yes.
Macduff, Lieutenant Peg Macduff. That's actually another big change we made from the movie. In the movie, um, uh, in the story in Scotland, PA, Macduff is a police lieutenant who comes from Harrisburg to try to solve figure out what happened to the death of Duncan. And in the movie, it's played by Christopher Walken. And we decided to change that part to be a woman. So we changed it to Lieutenant Peg Macduff. And the wonderful, wonderful Megan Lawrence played that that role. Um, oh gosh, who else was in our cast? So I'm gonna feel bad if I forget someone. Um, uh, Will Myers played the character of Malcolm. The character is a teenager, so Will's a teenager himself. So he was making, I think it might have been his off-Broadway debut. He had done a lot of work in out in LA and TV, um, but he was really fantastic. And another change we made from the movie, in the film, Duncan has two sons, as he does in the Shakespeare play, Donald and Malcolm. And in the movie, Donald is uh, or in the movie, one of the sons is a football player who sort of ends up becoming a suspect in his father's death, and the other is a character who you find out is gay but hasn't come out to his family. And so we, in our musical, combined those two characters into one. So Duncan has just one son, Malcolm, who is a football player and comes out as gay, unbeknownst to his family. Um, uh, yeah, so there were a number of changes that we made to the film along the way.
And it's likely that at some point we may have a cast album of this.
I hope so. I hope so. We had some plans to do it before the world sort of fell apart. um, uh, but uh, but we're working with a wonderful producer to hopefully give the show some more life. And having a cast album is part of all that. So there are a lot of questions right now in terms of when and how things are going to happen with the shutdown and COVID and all of that. But we've still been at it. In fact, we did a Zoom workshop of a new draft of the script in the midst of all this madness. So hopefully one day there'll be more Scotland PA to enjoy out in the world.
Is it likely to be produced? Is there definite interest at this point?
I hope so. I hope so. We've definitely been contacted by some theaters who are interested in the show. Obviously, when they're able to do it, we were supposed to have had a production that got unfortunately postponed because of the shutdown. So lots of questions, but I'm hopeful that there will be interest once we're back.
So just over a few other things, tell us some of the awards you've won for your songwriting.
Oh goodness. I've been very fortunate. One of the first awards I received was the Fred Ebb Award, um, uh, in honor, obviously, of the late Fred Ebb. I also was very lucky to receive the Kleban Award, which is specifically given every year to a lyricist and a librettist. Um, this musical String that I was talking about earlier received the Richard Rogers Award a couple years ago, which is a wonderful kind of developmental support award. Um, uh, and I was really tickled. I was nominated for a Drama Desk Award for Scotland, PA, which was just a wonderful treat, especially in the midst of not being able to do theater. It was a nice boost to receive that in the midst of the shutdown.
Now, are you planning any new things as you have a little more time than you probably would have had?
I'm at the very early stages of a couple new things. Michael Mitnick and I have another commission from the Roundabout, so I think we're gonna do an original show rather than adapting something this time around. So starting to bat around ideas for that. And yeah, sort of, I've taken this time really to just kind of take some of the pressure off and see what inspires me. I've discovered a couple things which have grabbed my interest, and just sort of seeing where they might lead. But it's been nice to slow things down for a little bit anyway.
How often are you actually leaving Queens?
Not very often, I have to say. My partner and I, who both live here in Queens, we've done a couple short trips just to see our families. His family's in Pennsylvania, my family's down in Baltimore. But for the most part, we've just sort of stayed hunkered down and stuck it out here in New York.
Does he have any theater connections?
He does. Give me what I have to run to the bathroom for 1 second, but I'll
Okay.
be right back. I'm just gonna pause.
His collaborator, Michael Mitnick, has done two very wonderful things. One he did at Playwrights Horizons, which was called, I believe, Fly With Me, or Fly by Night. And that too was a very inspiring kind of story where, you know, things just looked like they were headed in one way, and then they suddenly got much better, which is what we like to see. And then he also wrote what would have been an incredible movie about called The Current Wars, about the discovery about how electricity was sent over the wires or over the air. And this, he spent many years, and he's the sole writer of this movie. And I think it would have had a wonderful British actor who starred in it, Bernard Cumberbatch, I think. And unfortunately, it was produced by Harvey Weinstein.
So
So
sorry about that.
it was telling them about Michael Mitnick and the Current Wars.
Oh,
So
nice.
don't you, doesn't he feel too that this should have been a very successful movie? It has all the elements, except it has Harvey Weinstein.
It's true. He went through a heck of a time with that musical, and it was all sort of happening while we were working on Scotland, PA. Like he went to London when they filmed it over there, and yeah, and it had an interesting life. He actually wrote it first as a musical, because Michael is a songwriter as well, and um, I think it was his thesis at Yale. He wrote that story as a musical. I've heard songs from his musical adaptation of it, and at some point, someone suggested that he adapt it as a screenplay and not as a musical, which is what he ended up doing, and found its way to Harvey Weinstein and beyond. But yeah, he went on quite a ride with that with that process.
I kept seeing coming attractions. I said, my God, this is a good movie.
Yeah.
I realized they were afraid to release it because of Harvey's name. And ultimately, I think people just dismissed it and said, we don't want to help him. But at that point, I think the movie was taken away from Harvey. So people could have seen it and loved it, couldn't they?
Yeah, it was a very convoluted road, because I remember, like, the movie was it was scheduled to be released right around that sort of prestige time of, like all, like Christmas or something, and they released the trailers and everything, and then the scandal hit, and they pulled it, and it went through. I'm probably not the one to tell exactly what happened, but it went through. There was quite a bit of rigmarole in terms of like what was happening to, I think, all of Harvey Weinstein's movies in terms of who
Right.
got control of them and who was able to release them, and it was like able to be released in Europe first or something. It was a very complicated, uh, I'm sure, very frustrating process for Michael, because
Because
he'd worked on it for so long.
the music was not written by, the music was very interesting. Do you know anything about the guy who wrote the background score for the
Um,
movie?
I don't actually. I don't. Um,
Because
yeah,
I
and I
mean,
don't.
there probably would have been a soundtrack, except again for Harvey being
Yeah,
involved and say we don't want a soundtrack about Harvey. I wonder if that, he had
yeah.
contacted me through the Footlight website,
Oh
saying
yeah,
he wanted to talk to me about something. I wondered whether it could have been to put that soundtrack out. So I don't know what the
oh maybe. Well,
legalities or anything of that would have been, but if there was a
yeah,
way it could have been done, I would have done something like that because it was a most unusual soundtrack.
yeah. And I think that the original musical version of the story that Michael wrote, I think it's being produced in Pittsburgh, um, which is where he's from. Again, assuming once we're able to have live theater again. But there's a theater in Pittsburgh that is interested in producing the musical version of the current war. So I'm looking
So
forward to that as well.
is he currently in Pittsburgh? Is that where he is?
Um, I don't
He was
know.
in
The last time
Brooklyn.
I talked,
Was in
he
Brooklyn.
wasn't. He wasn't. The last time I talked to him, he was in Brooklyn. But I think it's been a couple weeks, few weeks since I talked to him last. So it's possible that he might be somewhere else.
So do you have any other things to what would you advise people when they come to New York? What are some of the things that you could encourage people or discourage people?
Mm. As far as, songwriters, I would say, um, just find opportunities to get your songs out there as often as possible. The When I was first starting out, the cabaret and the concert scene was a huge boon, not just in terms of getting songs out there, but meeting my fellow composers and fellow theater people. It was uh, there's such a wonderful community out there, and I would just encourage you to try to be as much a part of it as you can. Um, and hopefully soon we'll be able to once again come together and hang out in rooms and sing songs together, because I certainly miss it, and I'm sure younger songwriters who are arriving in New York are missing it too. It's just not the same singing over a Zoom call.
It was nice. I mean, I love the fact I just zoomed to London the other day.
Oh wow.
It's just so exciting that it costs nothing. I mean, a
Yeah.
phone call to a. There are other ways that I know there's Skype and other ways, but a traditional phone call, which is that I'm 80 years old, and that would be my thought is to phone somebody, and
Yeah.
that's too expensive. But I just called somebody who I've not talked to in 20 years,
Oh,
and
that's amazing.
trying to talk. He doesn't know how to do Zoom. He's he's a youngster of 70, so he has to get a 10-year-old kid to probably set him up with Zoom. But
Right.
Zoom can be very easy. We had a little problem scheduling this, but once we connected today, it all went quite well. And again, I thank you for joining us, and I hope that we can talk to you again when you have further projects.
Oh, I would love that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.